The moment I bought my 3-acre property in Maple Ridge County, I knew I had finally escaped the cycle of apartment leases, rent increases, and neighbors who treated shared living like open warfare. The house itself was nothing special, an old 1963 brick place with uneven steps and windows begging for replacement, but the land was peace itself. Oaks framed the lot like natural sentries. Birds sang without city noise drowning them out, and for the first time in my 42 years, freedom felt like something I could touch. As a Black woman, widowed, and a software engineer who spent decades building financial stability while the world demanded twice as much to give back half as little, signing those papers felt like inhaling for the very first time. The real estate agent handed me the keys, smiling politely, oblivious to the quiet storm inside me that whispered, "This is mine, and nobody will take it." What they didn't tell me, what none of the glossy listings or cheerful voices on the phone mentioned, was that my land used to fall under a long-defunct homeowners association called the Maple Ridge Community Standards Association, dissolved 10 years earlier after a well-documented scandal. I checked the title twice, then hired a lawyer and checked a third time, because being a Black homeowner taught me one lesson early: paperwork is oxygen, and survival depends on not letting others control the narrative. Every attorney confirmed the same thing at Joe of dissolved, no dues, no obligations. Which meant when I chose to build a 6-foot cedar fence around the back half of my property so my rescue dogs, Duke and Pepper, could roam safely, I didn't expect anyone to care. I had a signed permit from the county. I budgeted every penny. I filed every form. I did everything by the book. The book, however, is meaningless to people who rewrite the rules for themselves. The first day fence posts went in. A black Chevy Tahoe with no license plates rolled to a stop at the edge of my driveway. 2 white men stepped out wearing navy polo shirts with gold stitching that read MRCSA Enforcement. Starship badges clipped to their belts, invisible sidearms, real guns, not props. My contractor, a grizzled 60-year-old with hands like leather gloves, whispered, "Are those cops?" The uniforms tried to say yes, but the stitched fake title, mismatched gear, and unplated SUV screamed whoever they were. Authority wasn't legally included. The taller one strutted forward, projecting authority like a man used to people flinching when he spoke. "You the homeowner?" he demanded. I answered yes. He introduced himself as Chief Officer Clark, pointing to the other man, Officer Lane. Then, without missing a beat, he announced I was in violation of HOA Code 7.1 to unauthorized fencing, and construction must cease immediately. I held his stare unblinking and informed him calmly that Maple Ridge HOA was dissolved in 2015 by court order. His eyes flickered with irritation, but his voice did not. "We reinstated authority last year," he said. "Standards remain enforceable." He spoke as though reinvention was as easy as putting on a badge print shirt. I gestured toward the Tahoe. "Then where are your plates?" Clark ignored the question, escalating instead. "If you proceed, fines are $500 per day and may include forced removal. We also have the authority to place a county lien," my contractor muttered. "Lady, I'm not working with fake cops pointing guns." I agreed, but I wasn't backing down. "Unless you have real county paperwork," I told Clark. "Construction continues." His partner rested his hand deliberately on his gun holster, thumb tapped, a threat wrapped in casual posture. Clark stepped closer. "Ma'am, don't make this difficult." I pulled out my phone and hit record. Everything changed. "You are on private property impersonating law enforcement," I said into the camera. "Leave or be charged with trespass." They hesitated, the camera a barrier their arrogance hadn't anticipated. After a tense moment, Clark muttered, "We'll be back with papers," and they left, wheels crunching gravel, disappearing down the road in silence. But intimidation is a seed some people plant hoping fear will bloom. They underestimated the soil they were dealing with. That night, I opened my laptop and began researching like a woman possessed. I dug into public records, lawsuits, tax filings, and county rulings. Maple Ridge HOA had not only been dissolved, they were barred from reinstating operations without county reauthorization and community member vote. The former board president, Eldon Clark, sued previously for impersonating an officer to collect fines, settled quietly. The details painted a profile not of authority, but of men who lost power and spent years hungry to reclaim it. I printed every document and placed them in a binder like ammunition. Then I called my cousin, Brandon Turner, a federal marshal with no patience for wannabe cops with guns. When I explained they brandished weapons while demanding fines under a dissolved entity, his tone went from joking to razor sharp. "That's felony impersonation under federal jurisdiction," he said. "If they're claiming enforcement of federal code, civil rights enforcement, or collection authority, that becomes a federal matter." His voice dropped lower. "Danica, how far you want this to go?" I watched the moon glow over the unfinished fence through the window, my dog sleeping peacefully, peace that I earned, peace I refused to sacrifice. "If I back down," I said softly, "I won't just lose the fence, I'll lose the land because fear becomes ownership." Brandon exhaled through the receiver. "Say less. Document everything." 3 days later, they returned same Tahoe. Same stitched shirts, but now they brought a woman holding a clipboard and a superiority complex in designer sunglasses. She introduced herself as HOA Administrator Kernholt, extending a cease construction notice toward me. This time, I didn't flinch. Instead, I placed a folder on the hood of their unmarked SUV containing the dissolution judgment and federal statute references for impersonation under Title 18 U.S. 912 and civil rights violation under Section 1983. Any attempt to collect dues or enforce defunct authority, I stated clearly, qualifies as impersonation of federal authority and civil rights interference under color of law. The confidence on their faces evaporated. Clark's jaw clenched. "You think you can Google your way out?" I cut him off before he finished. "I don't need Google. I have evidence, recordings, and direct access to the U.S. Marshals." For the first time, fear not intimidation stirred behind their eyes. Karen stammered, offering that maybe we could resolve this amicably if I removed the fence voluntarily. I smiled, calm and slow, like someone placing the final move in a game their opponent didn't realize they'd been losing. "No." They turned away, retreating with stiff shoulders, but as the Tahoe rolled down the road, I saw something I hadn't noticed before: a second SUV parked behind a willow tree, recording the encounter, like surveillance. Like they weren't a dissolved HOA, but something more organized and far more desperate. I closed my front door and locked it, not out of fear, but preparation. Because I knew this wasn't over. They expected someone intimidated, silent, and easily manipulated. But they chose the wrong homeowner, and the wrong Black woman. The first threat came softly, disguised as coincidence. That night, long after my contractor packed his tools and the sun slipped behind the tree line, the dogs grew restless. Duke remained at the door, silent but alert, while Pepper paced back and forth across the hardwood like her paws touched flames. I dismissed it at first, assuming new surroundings and lingering construction noise kept them uneasy. But animals don't get fooled by paperwork or titles. They respond to presence, and something or someone was out there. Around midnight, motion lights outside the garage snapped on. I peered through the blinds, careful not to silhouette myself, and saw nothing but the fence posts standing like toothpicks in the moonlight. The air felt heavier, though, like the quiet wasn't absence of sound, but suppression of it. At 2:17 a.m., my phone buzzed, unknown number. A text message appeared: "You're making this harder than it needs to be." No name, no signature, just implication clear as a gun barrel. I took a screenshot and forwarded it directly to Brandon with a simple message. They're escalating. His reply was immediate. Keep lights on, document everything, and don't go outside alone. The weight of that instruction pressed on me. I had lived 30 years learning how to avoid danger that society insisted didn't exist, but tonight was different. This was targeted, personal, calculated. The next day, my contractor's truck never arrived. I called him twice, left a voicemail, then texted. Hours passed with no response. By noon, I received a message from him filled with regretful apologies. Nice lady, I can't risk it. Some men came by my house this morning. They said there'd be trouble if I continued the job. I got grandkids. I'm sorry. They went after his family, not fines. Not warnings, threats. They weren't just bullies. They were operating from desperation and delusion. That makes people dangerous. Instead of breaking me, it fueled something dormant within me, something my late husband, Cameron, used to call your calm fire. Cameron knew how often Black women swallow their own voices to keep peace, to keep jobs, to keep their lives intact. He used to tell me, you don't raise your voice. Johnny, you set it down gently and still make the floor shake. I felt that now, shaking beneath my ribs. I spent the next 2 hours on calls. New contractor, no luck. County Compliance Office, no record of any reinstated HOA authority. Sheriff's Office, I asked whether Maple Ridge HOA had enforcement rights. They told me plainly that any attempt to collect fines or trespass with weapons would be investigated as criminal activity. When I asked whether I could have deputy patrol pass the property, the answer was polite but unsatisfying. We don't patrol for civil disputes. I didn't push the issue. Not yet. Later that afternoon, a black envelope was taped to my front door. No postage, no name, just black like it arrived from a void. Inside was a single piece of printer paper with one sentence typed in bold caps. Fences divide communities. I felt the weight of irony so thick it almost made me laugh. Communities? From people driving unmarked SUVs with guns, hiding behind names that no longer held legal standing, enforcing power they invented because it was taken from them. That was not community. That was empire tiny, petty empire, but empire nonetheless. That evening, I received an email from Brandon marked urgent. Attached was a scanned document, an official letterhead from the U.S. Marshals Service laying out federal statute references regarding impersonation of federal authority, conspiracy, extortion, harassment, and possession of a firearm during commission of a felony. In the email, Brandon wrote, I'm flying in Friday. Keep everything documented, no confrontations. We'll handle this correctly and legally. Relief washed over me, but only for a moment. Friday was 4 days away. That night, the fear tactics escalated. Around 11:45 p.m., tires rolled gravel outside slow, crunching, deliberate. Not passing through, stopping, staying. From the living room window, through blinds tilted barely enough to peer, I counted 2 SUVs. No headlights. Just silhouettes with engines idling like growling beasts. They remained there 10 minutes, then 20. I considered calling the sheriff, but what would I say? 2 cars exist near my house. Suspicion isn't a crime until they act on it. At midnight, a flashlight beam sliced across the backyard like a wandering spotlight searching for fugitives. Duke growled low. Pepper barked frantically. I grabbed my phone and hit record, narrating what I saw. 2 figures, one short, one stocky, walked along the fence posts, inspecting them, writing in a notebook, occasionally shining light toward the windows. They were building a case, fabricating proof, creating documentation that would appear legitimate in the hands of someone who didn't know the history. But they made one mistake. The short one turned toward the house, flashlight landing directly over his chest. Briefly, half a second, I saw the logo stitched into his shirt. RCSA enforcement, not security. Not contractor, not county, impersonators. I moved to the kitchen, stayed low, and captured footage from a different angle. At 12:24 a.m., both men froze, looked toward the road, then hurried back to the SUV. A second later, a pair of headlights swung down the street, approaching slow and steady. The SUVs peeled away in opposite directions. The approaching vehicle wasn't sheriff. I recognized the outline, my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, driving her ancient silver Buick down the middle of the street because she always said lanes were suggestions. She must have seen something because she parked quickly in front of my house, leaving her headlights on as though illuminating my yard was an act of protest. Moments later, my phone buzzed. Message from Mrs. Alvarez. Don't worry, Mia. They don't scare me. I stared at the screen, shocked, touched, and confused all at once. I never told her what happened. Yet she knew or sensed or maybe heard enough whispers from the wind that carries neighborhood secrets. When I checked the mailbox the next afternoon, another envelope waited, this time in legal-sized yellow paper, printed with the Maple Ridge Community Standards Association logo in pale blue ink, demanding I cease construction within 48 hours or be subject to civil penalties and property forfeiture. At the bottom, in cheap cursive signature, was the name Chief Officer Eldon Clark, the same man banned years earlier. The final line sent ice through my stomach. Failure to comply may result in field enforcement. They didn't even hide the threat now. The war had begun. And I realized something important. They weren't just bluffing. They believed they had the right to do this, which meant they expected nobody, especially not a widowed Black woman, to ever fight back. They were wrong. I woke up Thursday morning to the sound of wind rattling the unfinished fence boards and Duke whining softly at the back door. Pepper had already stationed herself on the living room rug, ears twitching, alert to a sound only she seemed to hear. I brewed coffee slowly, savoring the warmth of the mug between my hands, because I knew the next few days would be relentless. Brandon was flying in tomorrow, and we had a long list of legal and tactical measures to take. But until then, I needed to document every shred of activity, every noise, every message, every vehicle that dared cross my property line. Fear couldn't rule my home, not tonight, not ever. I started with the driveway. Security cameras I had installed last week provided a perfect vantage point, and I had a backup drone ready with night vision capabilities. Every post on the fence was photographed, every angle of the land recorded, every tool I touched cataloged in a digital ledger I had started for insurance purposes. This wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. The so-called HOA officers, Eldon Clark and his crew, had proven they were willing to impersonate authority and brandish weapons to bully me. That alone elevated the situation from civil nuisance to federal violation, and I intended to make sure it stayed there. By mid-morning, the first call started. My contractor had sent a frantic message. Another neighbor had seen an unmarked SUV slow down near his house. The same black Tahoe from Monday's encounter. They were following the contractors now, trying to intimidate anyone helping me. I recorded the message, timestamped it, and added it to the growing federal case file Brandon and I were assembling. I knew from experience that meticulous documentation would be my strongest weapon. Evidence doesn't lie, even if people do. I decided to confront the reality of staying alone at the house. I had grown up in a neighborhood where looking the other way often came with consequences, but this was different. This wasn't some minor dispute over a fence or a barking dog. This was calculated harassment by people who thought their self-invented authority could scare a Black woman into submission. I reminded myself of everything I had overcome, moving cross-country for college, surviving a toxic marriage, losing Cameron to a sudden heart attack, and building my career from the ground up while fighting the subtle daily prejudices that tried to convince me I was expendable. I could handle this too. Around noon, I drove to the county clerk's office to double-check the official records. Every clerk I spoke to confirmed the Maple Ridge HOA was legally dissolved. No reinstatement had been filed. No authority was ever granted. I made photocopies of every document, ensuring my file contained clear proof that the so-called officers had no jurisdiction, no rights, and no legal standing. I even brought the photocopies to a notary public and had them stamped and notarized. By the time I returned home, I had an envelope labeled Federal Evidence, Do Not Open Until Marshal Arrival, sitting on my kitchen counter. Back home, I reviewed the footage captured over the last 3 nights. The SUVs were there again, moving slowly along the perimeter, lights off, cameras raised. I noticed patterns, how they lingered near certain fence posts, how they communicated silently, how they sometimes disappeared for hours only to return. They were professional enough to avoid direct confrontation during daylight, but too sloppy to disguise the fact that I was being watched constantly. I felt a surge of anger, but also clarity. They were counting on fear to weaken me. I wasn't afraid. I was ready. That evening, I contacted a friend who worked in cybersecurity to help secure my home network. I needed to ensure that no digital intrusion could compromise the files I was collecting. They walked me through firewall settings, encrypted storage, and remote access protocols. Everything was locked down. Even if the SUVs returned with cameras or microphones, they wouldn't touch my digital evidence. I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that I had controlled every angle, physical, digital, and legal. At sunset, I walked the property with Duke and Pepper. The dog's excitement at the rustling leaves was infectious. I paused at the line where the fence would eventually meet the back corner of the lot. I imagined the cedar planks rising tall, the dogs running safely within, and the sense of ownership solidifying. This fence wasn't just wood and nails. It was a symbol of autonomy, of a Black woman asserting her right to live on land she earned. I thought about Clark Lane and Karen Holt, and how they believed they could intimidate me. I smiled to myself. Let them try. Later that night, Brandon called from the airport. His voice was calm but urgent. Donica, I've reviewed everything you sent. This is textbook impersonation and harassment. We're going to serve federal arrest warrants the moment I land. They're expecting fear. You're going to give them law. I felt a thrill run through me. Law, authority, and justice were now tools in my hands. I wasn't powerless. I was preparation in motion. I spent the remainder of the evening reviewing every recorded message, every email, every video clip. I labeled and time-stamped everything meticulously. By the time the clock struck midnight, I felt like a general preparing her army. This wasn't a fight that relied on brute force. It relied on intelligence, patience, and procedure. The fence was almost done, a visible reminder that I refused to yield. Every post planted was a statement. Every plank nailed was a testament to my resilience. And then, just before sleep, I checked the driveway one last time through the security cameras. 2 SUVs sat idling at the corner, blacked out windows, silent engines, watching, waiting. The moment they moved toward the house, I reminded myself of the mantra Cameron taught me, calm fire. I would not scream. I would not panic. I would record, document, and act when the time was right. The war had been declared, and tomorrow Brandon would arrive. Tomorrow, federal authority would meet fake authority. Tomorrow, the game changed entirely. Sleep came briefly that night, a shallow but satisfying rest, knowing that every fence post, every recorded message, and every legal document strengthened my position. The night had been theirs, but the fight was mine, and I was ready to turn the tables. Brandon's flight was delayed twice. What was supposed to be a mid-morning arrival turned into a late afternoon touchdown. With every hour passing, tension thickened like fog, settling low over ground silent, heavy, distorting perception. The SUVs didn't show themselves Thursday night, but absence wasn't comfort. It was strategy. They expected me to relax, lower my guard, make mistakes. Instead, I used the time to refine the case file to the point a judge could read it like a screenplay, who said what, when they stood where, why their actions escalated, and how it violated federal law. I typed every instance with timestamps, GPS coordinates pulled from camera metadata, and annotated screenshots. It wasn't just a file, it was a trap disguised as paperwork. Around 3 o'clock Friday, I heard the unmistakable low boom of an airplane approaching airport descent. Brandon's message appeared seconds later, landing. 10 minutes to your place. Relief didn't wash over me, it marched in like reinforcement soldiers. I stood at the kitchen counter, reviewing my printed dossier, flipping the pages like a battle plan. When Brandon's black government sedan rolled into my driveway, Duke and Pepper barked as if greeting a familiar alpha returning to the pack. Brandon stepped out wearing civilian clothes, simple black jeans, and a gray jacket, but even casual, authority clung to him like a tailored suit. He hugged me briefly, eyes scanning the perimeter as naturally as breathing. "You got cameras covering every blind spot?" he asked. I nodded. "Good, because we're not just responding, we're recording their crimes as they commit them." Inside, I had the evidence binder across the dining table. Brandon flipped through pages silently, occasionally nodding, occasionally smirking at just how thorough it was. "You build a better case than most law firms I've worked with," he said. "This isn't just intimidation, this is conspiracy." He paused at the typed threats. "And this right here," he tapped the black envelope note, "is interstate harassment if we can trace their communication networks." Then he unzipped his bag and placed 2 sealed envelopes on the table official federal forms, labeled Notice of Federal Custody Hearing and Preliminary Warrant Checkout Authorization. "Before you ask," he said, "these are not the final arrest warrants. Those require a judge's signature and a sworn affidavit. But what we can do is serve notice of federal intention and demand immediate identification." My eyebrows lifted. "So we're serving them?" Brandon nodded. "We're not arresting. We're inviting them to lie to federal officers on camera. Once they do," he tapped the binder, "the real warrants get signed." The sun dipped lower, shadows creeping across the kitchen floor like approaching waves. Brandon studied my face with a seriousness only family earned the right to deliver. "When they come, and they will stand your ground, but don't antagonize. Let me handle the conversation. You film from 2 angles. I'll film from 1. Their responses will bury them." At dusk, Mrs. Alvarez shuffled across the yard, carrying a plate of fresh empanadas, as though this were a neighborly barbecue instead of a federal sting operation. She didn't speak much English, but her eyes showed understanding deeper than language. "They come again," she said quietly, glancing toward the road. "I bang my pots so loud the dead wake up." She winked before returning home, leaving behind warmth that wasn't from the food. Then silence. Not peaceful silence pregnant, heavy silence filled with waiting. At 8:14 p.m., the familiar crunch of gravel signaled arrival. 1 SUV first, then another, followed by a third vehicle I hadn't seen before, a white van with no signage. "Stay calm," Brandon murmured, sliding his phone into recording position. Duke growled low, but stayed beside me. Pepper's hackles rose. Clark emerged first, his arrogance wrapped tighter, like he'd put on a fresh layer of self-importance along with his cologne. Beside him walked Lane and Holt. The third vehicle's driver stepped out last older. Weathered face, silver mustache curled like old Western lawmen. If Clark was pride and Lane was threat, this man was calculation. He spoke first. "Evening. We understand you've been misinformed about the authority of the Ripple Ridge Community Standards Association." Brandon stepped outside before I could reply, calm but commanding. "Evening. And you are?" he asked. The mustache man extended a hand as though negotiations were over before they began. President Emeritus and Enforcement Liaison Harold Denton. Brandon didn't take the hand. Federal Marshal Service, he said, holding up credentials. The shift in their posture was microscopic but seismic. Shoulders squared became shoulders stiffened. Eyes steady became eyes darting. Silence became fear disguised as indignation. Brandon continued, "You have been reported for impersonation of federal and county authority, armed harassment, and attempted extortion under color of law. Under Title 18 and Section 1983, those are federal offenses." He handed Denton the preliminary warrants paper that weighed like brick. Holt snatched her copy like she could snuff it out by holding it tightly. Clark scoffed, trying to regain control. "You can't walk in here and claim federal jurisdiction over a community dispute." Brandon cocked his head. "Then why are you armed?" His gaze dropped deliberately to Clark's holstered gun. "And why did you threaten property forfeiture?" He flipped to a clipped copy of their typed letter. Using language reserved only for federal agencies, Denton cleared his throat. "We are a recognized association reclaiming governance." Brandon smiled. "Not kindness, but victory. The county says otherwise. The state says otherwise. And unless you have congressional recognition tucked into your glove box, the federal government says otherwise." Clark stepped forward, aggressive instinct swallowing logic. "Look, this woman." Brandon cut him off with a single raised palm. "This homeowner," he corrected, emphasis sharp enough to slice. Lane, silent till now, shifted his weight hand drifting too near his holster. Brandon's voice dropped low. "Don't touch that weapon. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise." Silence again. Then Denton broke the stalemate, turning his facade diplomatic. "Perhaps we can resolve this without courts involved." Brandon nodded agreeably. "Absolutely." "State your legal authority to enforce anything." The men exchanged glances. Holt opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "We acknowledge that reinstatement is still processing." Brandon's smile widened. "So, you admit you have no current authority?" Denton's jaw flexed. "We admit nothing," I finally spoke, steady and quiet. "Your presence here tonight, armed and threatening fines, ends now." Brandon pulled one more form from his folder formal cease and desist under federal observation. "You are ordered to vacate this property and cease contact pending federal review." For a long second, nobody moved. Finally, Denton nodded once, a move, not of agreement, but retreat. "This isn't finished," Clark muttered as they turned back toward their vehicles. Brandon answered, "Correct. Next time, we'll bring more paper and handcuffs." Engines roared. Tail lights disappeared. Brandon exhaled deeply. "You just won the first battle," he said. "But they're desperate, and desperate men stumble into crimes faster." Inside, as Pepper finally relaxed against my leg and Duke lay across my feet, a new understanding settled over me. This wasn't about offense. It was about power, control, territory they thought belonged to them and resented that a black woman held legally, confidently, loudly, and if they wanted a war, they were going to get one with every law on my side. By the time Brandon and I returned home that evening, the news had already spread across the neighborhood like wildfire. Brandon's calm yet commanding tone at the HOA clubhouse had stripped those men of the power they had hidden behind for years. The weight of federal law, real law, hung over them, and for the first time since Monday's confrontation, the streets were quiet. No black SUVs, no unmarked trucks, no anonymous notes or veiled threats. Just a quiet suburb sitting under a tense blanket of consequences. Even the birds roosting in the cypress trees seemed aware that the wind had shifted. Inside, Duke paced the living room, restless, while Pepper stretched lazily on the couch as if she had been the real mastermind behind every legal strategy we deployed. I poured iced tea and sat across from Brandon at the kitchen table. He removed his jacket slowly and loosened his tie with that familiar seriousness I remembered from years of watching him in courtrooms and negotiations. They weren't expecting documentation, he said flatly. They assumed fear would do more than proof ever could. That line repeated in my head long after he said it. Fear versus proof. Fear had controlled so many of us for generations, sometimes for lifetimes. Fear of retaliation, fear of being singled out, fear that speaking up would only magnify the problem. I had felt that fear walking out into my front yard Monday morning with 2 guns pointed at me. But now, proof was louder. Proof was tangible. Proof was protection. The doorbell rang at 8:17 p.m., the sound echoing sharply against the tile floor. Brandon looked at me and nodded. I checked the camera with caution force of habit at this point, but this time, the face staring back at us wasn't Clark or Lane. It was the elderly woman we'd seen at the meeting, the one who had tried to warn us with her eyes before Karen's glare silenced her. I opened the door slowly. She clutched a folder to her chest like it was her only lifeline. "My name is Margaret Shepherd," she began with a trembling voice. I think I have information you'll want." Inside, she sat at the table and placed the folder down with gentle care, as if the paper inside could break. She explained that the HOA used to be legitimate 15 years ago. That was before Eldon Clark and his nephew Lane took over the board. Once the last real president passed away, they seized the name, imposed fees, and started collecting infractions from homeowners, mostly minorities, widows, elderly residents living alone. They targeted people who wouldn't fight back, Margaret whispered. Her fingers shook as she opened the folder. Inside were old minutes, financial records, and handwritten complaints that had been dismissed or silenced. Brandon skimmed the documents and shook his head, ghostly white. "This isn't just impersonation," he muttered. "This is racketeering." Margaret's eyes welled. "They threatened my son after he called them out. They said his contractor license had violations. The next month, his business was audited. After that, he stopped pushing. Anger prickled beneath my ribs, not just anger for myself. Anger for every person who lacked the means, the strength, or the support to challenge imposters with authority complexes and delusions of power. "Mrs. Shepherd," I said softly, "you did the right thing coming here." She squeezed my hand before leaving, relief and fear mingling like colors in a storm cloud. Brandon didn't waste a second. He scanned the documents, photographed them, and added them into the federal case folder. The walls of my living room had transformed into a strategic command center, files, maps, timestamps, and cross-reference evidence lining the table. What we had now was enough to bury them. But the night wasn't over. At 10:42 p.m., headlights swept across my living room. I checked the monitor and recognized the first. Tahoe immediately Clark's. He pulled up and parked at an angle that blocked half the road. Then another vehicle, and another. 3 total. "They're desperate," Brandon said calmly, scrolling through the camera feeds. This time, the men didn't storm out with the certainty of self-appointed law. They hovered near the back of the SUV, arguing in frantic whispers, their gestures wild and uncoordinated. Everything about them, from their posture to their muttered panic, confirmed what Margaret had suspected. Their empire wasn't built on authority, it was built on fear, and that foundation was crumbling. I stepped outside before Brandon could stop me, keeping the storm door between us. My camera blinked red, recording everything. Clark turned sharply at the sight of me. The swagger he once had was gone, replaced by exhaustion and barely contained rage. "You didn't have to do this," Clark called out, voice shaking. "You could have just stopped building the fence." I stared at him. "You didn't have to impersonate police officers and threaten me with a gun." His jaw tightened. Lane stepped forward, shoulders raised like a bull about to charge. "Do you know what happens if this goes federal, if you ruin us?" "Yes," I answered. "You get treated like every citizen you pretended to be above. Brandon stepped outside then, badge visible. His voice was calm steel. "Gentlemen, leave the premises immediately." "The marshals arrive in 12 hours." Clark froze. Lane's bravado evaporated. The third man, one I hadn't seen before, looked around wildly, like he had stumbled into the wrong side of history by accident. Slowly, reluctantly, they climbed back into their SUVs. Engines ignited. Tires rolled. No words exchanged. No threats. Just silence and defeat. Inside, the adrenaline left my body in one rush. I exhaled so deeply I felt 30 pounds lighter. Brandon placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Tomorrow," he said, "their world ends." I nodded. But I also felt something else rising, something I hadn't expected. Not bitterness. Not satisfaction. Not even revenge. Justice. And justice, unlike fear, wasn't temporary. Saturday morning arrived with a crisp, clear sky, the kind that feels almost too calm, like the universe is holding its breath before an explosion. I woke before dawn, Duke at my feet, and Pepper perched on the arm of the sofa, eyes alert. My coffee steamed as I reviewed the security footage one last time before Brandon arrived. Every SUV, every movement, every shadow from the past week had been recorded, labeled, and backed up on multiple drives. I felt ready. Not excited, not anxious, just ready. Brandon called at 7:12 a.m. "On our way," he said. "We're bringing backup. This isn't a negotiation anymore. This is enforcement." The word hung in the air. Enforcement. I could hear the engines in the distance before I saw them. A convoy of black SUVs and unmarked federal vehicles approaching. There were at least 6 in total, strategically arranged to prevent escape and ensure safety. Every marshal was dressed in plain clothes with badges visible, but their presence radiated authority different from the fake authority of Clark and his crew. I stepped outside as they parked. Brandon joined me, and together we did a final sweep of the perimeter. "They're here," he said calmly. "Once they see us, there's no running. Everything is recorded." Every word, every gesture. I nodded, feeling the tension in my shoulders melt slightly. For the first time, the people who had spent a week terrorizing me would meet someone with real power behind them. It didn't take long. Around 8:05 a.m., the first SUV carrying Clark, Lane, and Holt rolled into view. They hesitated, unsure whether to proceed or flee. Their confidence had long since dissolved into desperation. Brandon stepped forward, badge raised. "Eldon Clark, Lane, Karen Holt, Harold Denton," he called clearly. "You are being served with federal arrest warrants for impersonation of law enforcement, armed intimidation, harassment, and attempted extortion. Remain calm, comply, and follow instructions." Clark's face paled. Lane's shoulders slumped. Holt's lips trembled. They opened their mouths, stammering excuses, denials, protests, but the marshals were already moving. One team blocked the SUV's exits. Another approached with handheld cameras recording every step, every facial expression. I watched, amazed at the precision, at the sheer weight of authority they now faced. Brandon turned to me briefly. "Film everything from the side. Keep safe." "You've done everything right." I nodded, camera rolling, heart pounding but steady. The marshals began instructing Clark and Lane to step out of the SUV. Clark hesitated, his gun holstered, hand twitching as if hoping the vehicle would protect him. One of the marshals moved quickly, covering him with a tactical hand placement that left no room for error. Lane followed, pale and silent. Holt, still holding her clipboard like a shield, walked unsteadily to the marshals. "Do you understand why you are being arrested?" One of the marshals asked, voice firm but neutral. Clark opened his mouth, trying to respond, but the words faltered. Brandon, standing beside me, whispered, "Every lie, every hesitation, it's all on tape. Every attempt to justify your actions will only strengthen the case." The marshals read the charges aloud, and I could see the fear in their eyes finally. A clear human recognition that their games were over. Clark's voice cracked as he muttered, I didn't think anyone would, but his explanation dissolved into the cold air, irrelevant in the presence of documented evidence, sworn testimony, and federal law. Lane and Holt exchanged nervous glances, realizing fully for the first time that their authority had been a lie and their intimidation had been criminal. I stayed behind the safety line, camera in hand, capturing everything. My stomach had butterflies, but I felt a strange calm wash over me. The fence behind me, half completed but solid, symbolized more than property. It symbolized control reclaimed. My ownership, my safety, my dignity, it all culminated in this moment. Every threat, every SUV, every note, every motion light flickering in the night led here. And now, justice wasn't waiting in some distant court. It was here, executed with precision. Denton, the older man who had attempted diplomacy days earlier, was approached last. He tried to negotiate, to claim oversight, to imply that federal law didn't apply to his civil association. The marshal smiled politely and said, "Your actions meet all the criteria for federal criminal charges. You will be processed accordingly." Denton's composure crumbled. He glanced at Clark, then Lane, then Holt. All their faces told the same story: disbelief, anger, fear, and shame. The arrest itself was meticulous, professional, and humane. No one was harmed. No one resisted physically beyond mild flinches and murmured complaints. Each suspect was handcuffed, read their rights, and led to the waiting federal vehicles. I watched the entire scene unfold, feeling an odd combination of relief and triumph. The marshals were efficient, precise, and their presence undeniable. The lies, the guns, the threats, it all collapsed under the weight of real law. Once the last suspect was secured, Brandon approached me. "You did exactly what needed to be done," he said. "Every threat, every harassment call, every SUV following you recorded and documented. You gave the federal marshals the cleanest case I've seen in years. They won't be able to wiggle out of this." I smiled faintly, exhausted but elated. Duke nudged my leg as if acknowledging victory, and Pepper barked once, sharply, satisfied. By mid-morning, the SUVs were gone. The street was quiet. The threat that had loomed over me for nearly a week vanished in the blink of an enforcement vehicle's flashing lights. I stood by my unfinished fence, watching the sun reflect off the cedar posts, feeling a new sense of ownership settle over the property. This wasn't just about land anymore, it was about autonomy, respect, and the unwavering truth that intimidation and false authority do not prevail over courage and law. Brandon stayed for the remainder of the day, helping me finalize documentation and ensure that all evidence was secured for federal prosecution. We compiled video footage, photographs, witness statements, and records of every threat, email, and message. By evening, the case was airtight. There would be no loopholes. There would be no excuses. Clark, Lane, Holt, and Denton had overplayed their hand, and now they would face consequences far greater than any property dispute. As I finally settled into my couch that night, Duke at my feet and Pepper on my lap, I reflected on the events of the week. The fear, the threats, the SUVs, and the guns, all of it had tested me. Yet standing here, knowing I had not only defended my property but also upheld the law, filled me with a profound sense of accomplishment. I wasn't just a homeowner anymore, I was a symbol of resilience, proof that no fake authority could overpower truth, preparation, and courage. And while the fence wasn't quite finished yet, its presence alone was a statement. This land was mine, and no one, no matter how desperate or deluded, would ever make me think otherwise. The following week was a whirlwind of paperwork, interviews, and follow-ups. Federal prosecutors contacted Brandon directly, praising the meticulous documentation and video evidence I had compiled. "We rarely see a civilian who can provide this level of preparation," one prosecutor said. Your work has accelerated our timeline tremendously. I sat at my kitchen table, sipping tea, glancing at the cedar posts of the fence behind me. Every post, every plank, every nail had been a silent act of defiance, now validated by law. I felt a surge of quiet pride, one I knew would sustain me through the trials to come. Brandon coordinated the filing of federal charges against Eldon Clark, Lane, Karen Holt, and Harold Denton. Each charge was serious: impersonation of federal and local authorities, armed intimidation, attempted extortion, and conspiracy under color of law. The documents referenced every text, every voicemail, every SUV surveillance incident. When the suspect's attorneys received the filings, their tone shifted from brashness to defensive panic. They realized the game had changed entirely. These were not small-town scuffles anymore. This was federal law, and it came with consequences that could not be negotiated away with intimidation or lies. The media began to catch wind of the story within days. Local newspapers ran headlines: fake HOA officers arrested in armed intimidation case, and black homeowner exposes fraudulent authority with federal help. Some reporters called to interview me. I declined, most cautious of sensationalism, but allowed a few factual statements. I simply exercised my legal right to defend my property, I told one reporter. No one should feel threatened by people impersonating authority. I noticed that framing it in calm, factual terms garnered respect rather than pity. I wasn't a victim, I was a homeowner asserting her rights. The defendants, meanwhile, faced immediate repercussions beyond the federal arrests. Clark and Lane's personal reputations dissolved almost instantly in the neighborhood. Their families began receiving calls from community members who had been threatened or harassed. Holt, who had tried to appear diplomatic during our first confrontation, now faced scrutiny from former clients and acquaintances who had lent her authority credibility. Denton's position as the emeritus president crumbled under the weight of documented evidence of harassment and conspiracy. The HOA's empire, once cloaked in perceived legitimacy, had collapsed entirely, leaving them exposed to prosecution and civil liability. Back home, I worked on finishing the fence in the mornings before Brandon and the marshals arrived for scheduled witness sessions. By midweek, the cedar planks were complete, the gates installed and secured, and Duke and Pepper had space to roam freely without concern. Every nail hammered was a personal victory, every completed section a reminder that preparation and courage are as essential as law enforcement. The fence had started as protection for my dogs and property, but it had grown into a symbol of accountability and strength. By Thursday, federal agents returned to gather final statements and ensure all digital evidence was preserved. They requested interviews with me, Brandon, and several witnesses, including Mrs. Alvarez and Margaret Shepard. The agents were thorough, professional, and unwavering. Questions were detailed, precise, and aimed at establishing an irrefutable chain of evidence. I answered each calmly, providing timestamps, files, and recordings in a meticulous presentation. I felt an unexpected surge of confidence. Each answer, each document, each piece of proof built a narrative too precise for any of the imposters to distort. Meanwhile, the defendants attempted to delay proceedings through legal motions and objections. Their attorneys claimed technicalities, jurisdictional disputes, and procedural arguments, but federal prosecutors countered each motion with evidence that could not be dismissed: video footage, sworn witness statements, digital communications, and public records proving the HOA's dissolution. Every objection they raised only highlighted their desperation, and the judge overseeing the case quickly set deadlines for evidence submission and court appearances. Clark, Lane, Holt, and Denton were trapped in a legal cage of their own making, and they knew it. Throughout the week, I received calls from neighbors expressing relief and admiration. People shared stories of harassment they had suffered quietly over the years, now emboldened to speak openly knowing the federal authorities had acted decisively. I realized my personal struggle had catalyzed a community-wide exposure of injustice. My property, my fence, and my courage became more than symbols. They became catalysts for systemic accountability. I understood then that justice, when pursued relentlessly and prepared meticulously, ripples far beyond the immediate case. On Friday evening, I walked along the completed fence, brushing my hands over the cedar planks. The sun was low, casting golden light across the yard, illuminating every detail. I thought about the week, the threats, the SUVs, the sleepless nights, and the careful preparation. Every emotion, from fear to determination to triumph, had built this moment. Brandon stood beside me silently, watching, as if acknowledging that some victories are best appreciated in quiet reflection rather than celebration. "You did more than protect your property," he said finally, voice low. "You ensured that those men faced the consequences they earned. You didn't just fight for yourself. You fought for every person they thought they could intimidate." I nodded, feeling the weight and truth of his words. This wasn't about ego or revenge. It was about right and wrong, accountability and law, courage and meticulous action. As dust settled, Duke lay across my feet and Pepper nestled beside him. I realized that, for the first time in a long while, I could breathe. Fear no longer dictated the rhythm of my days or nights. The fake HOA officers had been exposed, federal action was in motion, and my home remained mine-safe, secure, and unchallenged. The battle wasn't over. Legal proceedings would continue for months, but the immediate threat had been neutralized, and my autonomy reaffirmed. The fence stood tall, cedar shining in the last light of day, a physical testament to resilience. But more importantly, it represented a larger truth. Authority built on fear and deception cannot withstand preparation, documentation, and legal recourse. The imposters had learned this the hard way, and my neighborhood, once vulnerable to harassment, now had a shield reinforced not only by cedar planks but by law and determination. And as I watched the horizon glow, I felt a sense of calm, of peace, and of triumph that no SUV, no threat, and no fake authority could ever take from me. By the following Monday, the federal court schedule was set. Clark, Lane, Holt, and Denton faced multiple charges, each backed by irrefutable evidence. Brandon and I prepared for court appearances, ensuring all documentation, video recordings, and witness statements were organized and accessible. I had expected fear to return, but surprisingly, it didn't. The weeks of surveillance, threats, and intimidation had forged something unshakable inside me. I wasn't just ready, I was resolute. The morning of the trial, the courthouse was crowded with reporters, neighbors, and curious onlookers. Cameras flashed as I entered, Duke faithfully at my side in spirit, if not in person, and Pepper absent-mindedly settled in the car during transit. The imposters arrived, their faces pale, their usual arrogance stripped away. Even Denton, the man who had once presented himself as a calm, authoritative figure, now seemed tense and faltering. The contrast was stark. Manufactured confidence had dissolved under the weight of federal scrutiny. The trial began with opening statements. The federal prosecutor presented the case clearly and methodically, detailing each act of impersonation, intimidation, and armed threat. Every text, every note, every motion light flicker, every recorded threat was laid bare. When they played the videos of Clark and Lane patrolling the driveway, of Holt's trembling hands clutching her clipboard, and of Denton's failed attempts at diplomacy, the courtroom fell silent. It was undeniable, incontrovertible proof that the so-called HOA had operated as a criminal enterprise. When it came time for my testimony, I felt a calm clarity. I recounted the events week by week, day by day, showing the court my careful documentation, screenshots, and video clips. I described the fear I had felt, yes, but also the resolve that guided every decision. I spoke not as a victim, but as a citizen defending her rights, her property, and the law. The jurors listened intently, and for the first time, I sensed the full weight of justice in motion. It wasn't about retribution, it was about accountability. The defense attempted to muddy the waters, suggesting that HOA's authority had been ambiguous, that the defendants had been misinformed, or that they acted without full knowledge of the law. But each claim crumbled under Brandon's meticulous cross-examination and the mountain of evidence we had assembled. Emails, letters, and the sworn statements of neighbors left no room for reasonable doubt. Even the defendant's own words, captured on tape and documented in federal filings, confirmed their criminal intent. By mid-afternoon, the jury had retired to deliberate. The tension in the courthouse was thick, and yet I felt a strange serenity. All the preparation, every sleepless night, every documented threat, every plank of the fence had led to this moment. Justice wasn't an abstract concept. It was tangible, visible, and unfolding before my eyes. A few hours later, the jury returned. The foreperson stood, voice steady, and delivered the verdict, guilty on all counts. Clark, Lane, Holt, and Denton were sentenced to significant prison terms, fines, and the mandatory revocation of any remaining claims to HOA authority. Their attempts to intimidate homeowners would now be permanently recorded as criminal acts, setting a precedent for the protection of property owners everywhere. The courtroom erupted in quiet relief. Neighbors whispered, reporters scribbled notes, and Brandon gave me a subtle nod. It was over. The imposters who had threatened me, who had driven SUVs through dark nights, who had waved weapons and tried to enforce imaginary laws, were defeated. They would face the consequences of their actions fully, and the fear they once wielded was gone forever. Walking back to my car, I thought about the journey over the past week. The fence outside my home had begun as a simple line of protection, a boundary to secure my property and my dogs. But it had grown into something much larger, a symbol of resistance, accountability, and empowerment. Every plank, every post, every nail had represented a refusal to yield to intimidation, a declaration that I, a Black woman, would not be silenced, threatened, or bullied. Back home, I finally completed the finishing touches on the fence. I stepped back to admire its cedar, glinting softly in the evening sun, gates firmly secured, and the yard safe once more. Duke ran happily along the perimeter, barking joyfully, while Pepper pranced in circles, her energy infectious. I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. My home was mine, protected by both law and personal resolve. Brandon lingered a moment, then handed me a small envelope. Inside was a letter from the federal court acknowledging my critical role in exposing the criminal operation and providing testimony that led to the successful prosecution of the defendants. You did more than secure your property, Brandon said quietly. You upheld the law, and you showed others that courage combined with preparation can defeat even the most audacious deception. I held the letter close, tears pricking my eyes. It wasn't just recognition, it was validation of every choice, every action, every moment of resolve. That night, I sat on the porch, Duke at my feet, Pepper on my lap, watching the stars emerge over the horizon. The night was calm, unthreatening, and deeply satisfying. I thought of the imposters, their power evaporated, and the community around me, now emboldened by the knowledge that deceit and intimidation cannot withstand truth and law. The fight had been real, intense, and frightening, but it had also proven one undeniable fact. Courage, preparation, and legal recourse are stronger than fear and false authority. As the night deepened, I reflected on the lessons I had learned. True authority is earned, not fabricated. Fear is temporary, but evidence, law, and courage endure. And a person who knows their rights and defends them with integrity can overcome threats that seem insurmountable. I had faced armed imposters, intimidation, and lies, and emerged victorious. Tomorrow, the neighborhood would wake to a story of accountability and justice. My fence would stand tall, my property secure, and my autonomy reaffirmed. The SUV patrols, the threats, the envelopes, and the false authority were gone, replaced by peace, protection, and empowerment. I had reclaimed not just my land, but my dignity, and in doing so, I had ensured that others could too. For the first time in days, I could breathe fully, knowing the home I loved, the land I had purchased, and the life I had built were safe. Duke snuggled against my legs, Pepper's eyes half closed in contentment, and the cedar fence shimmered softly in the moonlight. Justice had been served, and I had been its instrument. My home, my fence, my rights, they were mine, and no one could ever take them from me again.